Russia isn't merely struggling on land and in the air at the moment as it persists with its wasteful, unsustainable invasion of Ukraine. It's also having a hard time at sea. In fact, according to recent reports from NATO officials, the Russian Navy is experiencing a serious crisis, as evidenced by its humiliating retreat from the waters of the Mediterranean. NATO officials have naturally been keeping a close eye on Russian military movements of late, especially in the wake of recent drone incursions into NATO airspace in countries like Poland and Romania. Member nations need to be one step ahead of Russia at a time when so many world leaders are currently fearful of further Kremlin aggression or even a direct attack on a NATO nation like one of the Baltic states. As such, the alliance is keen to keep tabs on the Kremlin, monitoring its various assets, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. They've been tracking Russian naval assets in the Mediterranean Sea for some time, and one NATO representative recently revealed the shocking truth: Russia barely has any ships left in this particular body of water. The official, who has preferred to remain anonymous while speaking to the media, stated, "It's our assessment that the Russian Navy, which is already resource-constrained regarding where to place its assets, is experiencing force-generation challenges and dilemmas currently affecting its posture in the Mediterranean Sea." In other words, Russia is experiencing such serious problems of late, with so many of its assets either damaged, destroyed, or occupied elsewhere, it simply can't afford to maintain any sort of sizable force in the biggest sea in Europe. This is a dramatic shift. Russia has, throughout its history, strived to maintain a strong naval presence in the Mediterranean, officially known as the Permanent Task Force of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. Even if we go back to the days of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy also made it a priority to have a fleet in the Mediterranean too, officially known as the 5th Operational Squadron. This shows how important the area is in the eyes of the country's leadership, both now and in the past, and it's not hard to understand why. The Mediterranean is not only the largest sea in Europe, but also one of the most significant bodies of water in the world. It's been a major center of trade and travel throughout the ages, serving as a strategic link between 3 separate continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there are over 20 countries that border the waters of the Mediterranean, including European nations like France, Italy, and Greece, Asian nations such as Turkey and Syria, and African countries like Egypt and Algeria. It stands to reason that Russia would want some sort of presence in that part of the world in order to project its power and influence into the region. And the Mediterranean was a notable Cold War theater, with the Soviets' 5th Operational Squadron serving as a foil for the US Navy's 6th Fleet, which controlled large parts of the sea at the time. Times have changed since then. The Soviet Union is no more and the Cold War has come to an end, but Russia has continued to operate vessels in the area, setting up its permanent task force in the Mediterranean Sea in 2013. This allows the Kremlin to maintain some sort of pressure towards NATO's southern flank, rather than effectively allowing the US and Europe to almost entirely control the area. It also gives Russia the opportunity to keep a close eye on movements and trade routes across the water, along with the possibility to intervene and disrupt those routes should it feel the need to do so, plus the ability to support any allies it may have in the region. In 2015, for example, Russia used ships in the Mediterranean as part of its intervention in the Syrian civil war, with the Kremlin lending its military support to the Syrian president at the time, Bashar al-Assad. When it was first formed, Russia's Mediterranean Task Force was made up of a mixture of vessels from the Black Sea Fleet and Northern Fleet, and it was stationed in Syria. It has historically been comprised of up to 15 warships, along with auxiliary vessels, and additional ships from the Baltic Fleet can be provided on demand should the task force need to carry out operations in the area. We've also seen Moscow operate multiple submarines in the Mediterranean in the past to strengthen its position and enhance its operational capabilities in the region. But that once mighty naval force appears to be no more, with Russia now operating just a few ships in the region at any given time. According to the NATO official who revealed the news, there are 2 main reasons behind the decline of Russia's Mediterranean naval force. The first and perhaps most significant reason is the loss of Russia's strategic port in the Syrian city of Tartus. This all stems back to the aforementioned Syrian civil war, in which Russia tried but ultimately failed to keep Bashar al-Assad in power and crush opposition offensives. The Kremlin held a lot of power in Syria for many years, but with the fall of the Assad regime in late 2024, its influence was effectively wiped out in one fell swoop. Indeed, only days after the regime was toppled, a report emerged from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, revealing that Russia had initiated a mass evacuation of both troops and military equipment from the 2 bases it held in the country: Latakia, which was the main Russian airbase in Syria, and Tartus, its naval base. Russia had relied heavily on Tartus for decades as its main refueling, docking, and maintenance location in the Mediterranean Sea, having first moved ships into the area in the early 1970s after a Soviet-Syrian lease agreement was signed. We saw exactly how important this base was during the war in Syria, when it was used for delivering weapons from Russia to the Assad regime. In 2015, Moscow and Damascus signed a brand new 49-year lease agreement, and Russia invested heavily in infrastructure, building up its presence in Tartus and stationing additional personnel and equipment at the site. Tartus has also been nicknamed Russia's window into Africa, providing a launch pad for the Kremlin to extend its tendrils of influence across the African continent. It was used, for example, for the deployment of Wagner Group mercenaries to various African nations, playing a massive role in Russia's mission to expand its geopolitical reach in countries like Cameroon, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, to name but a few. Having Tartus under Russian control was a win-win for both al-Assad and for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. But with al-Assad out of power, and now being said to be living a luxurious life in Moscow, Russia suddenly faced a harsh new reality. In January of this year, the new Syrian government effectively tore up the lease agreement between the two nations, officially kicking the Russians out of the area. In the days and weeks that followed, Russia was forced to evacuate its flotilla into the Mediterranean, sending additional support vessels like the cargo ship Sparta II and the landing ship Alexander Shabalin, among others, to the area to assist with the evacuation. Russian frigates that had called Tartus home for years, like the Admiral Gorshakov and Admiral Golovko, left the port for the last time, and despite its best efforts to negotiate an extended stay in the region, the Kremlin lost access to its only Mediterranean naval base for refueling, repairing and resupplying its local task force. The impact of that loss cannot be overstated. With Tartus, Russia had a base that it could turn to and rely on in the Mediterranean Sea. That made it much easier to maintain a sizable fleet in the region, as the various vessels involved always had somewhere to go and dock when needed. Troops and supplies could be loaded on and off the ships in Syria, and if Russia needed to take action at any time in the region, it had a force that was ready to be refueled and rolled out onto the water. Now, it has no such option. Instead, if Russia wants to continue operating vessels in the Mediterranean, it will have to deploy them from its other ports and naval bases, none of which are actually within the Mediterranean region. Indeed, the closest options Russia has right now are its Black Sea ports, including one in the Russian city of Novorossiysk and others in the occupied region of Crimea. Even then, it's not exactly easy for Russia to get ships from the Black Sea down into the Mediterranean, as they would have to travel long distances, using huge amounts of fuel in the process, and transit through Turkish-controlled straits. That would be problematic at the best of times, but it's an even bigger issue at the moment, as Russia is currently suffering through a serious and ever-worsening fuel crisis, brought about in large part by Ukraine's recent series of drone attacks on oil refineries, pipelines, and other fuel-related infrastructure across the country. The country barely has enough fuel to keep its war machine chugging along, so would certainly struggle to find excess stocks to power its naval vessels on their long journeys to the Mediterranean. The Kremlin could also make use of some of its other northern or Baltic ports, like the Baltic port, situated within the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea coast. However, ships leaving that location would have to travel even longer and more complicated routes to reach the Mediterranean. Even if the vessels made it that far, they'd have to stick to a tight schedule, ensuring that they begin the return journey in good time so that they don't run out of fuel or supplies before making it back to port. In short, losing control of Tartus has made it almost impossible for Russia's Mediterranean Sea task force to continue existing. As the NATO official puts it, with the loss of that port now, for example, if they bring a Kilo-class submarine into the area, they'll have to bring it all the way down there from one of their northern or Baltic ports. Being able to sustain operations is definitely more challenging. We saw evidence of this only weeks ago in late September, when the Russian submarine, codenamed Novorossiysk, was forced to surface near the Strait of Gibraltar. The 250-foot or 74-meter Kilo-class sub was on combat duty in the Mediterranean, but experienced some sort of technical failure. Fuel began leaking into the bilge at the bottom of the vessel's hull, and according to reports shared on social media channels like Telegram, the submarine did not have the necessary spare parts or even the relevant specialists on board to fix the issue. As such, it was forced to surface, and it was later spotted making the long trek back to the Baltic Sea to be repaired. This is a whole new level of challenge for the Russian Navy to handle. While it is still possible for them to get vessels, like the submarine, down to the Mediterranean, the absence of any official base or even a friendly port in the area means that every trip is far riskier than before, because if something goes wrong, help is a long, long way away. The second big reason why Russia appears to have reduced the size and scale of its Mediterranean fleet is because it now seems to be shifting its focus to the Baltic Sea, where NATO has been building a large-scale force of its own. In January, shortly after undersea cables in the Baltic were damaged, potentially by Russia, the alliance launched the Baltic Sentry mission, aimed at enhancing the protection of critical underwater infrastructure and improving allies' ability to respond to any acts or threats of destabilization in the Baltic region. Announcing the initiative, NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte said, "By working together with all allies, we will do what it takes to ensure the safety and security not only of our critical infrastructure, but of all that we hold dear." This mission has involved the deployment of NATO frigates, patrol aircraft, drones, and national monitoring assets, strengthening the alliance's posture in the region while simultaneously putting pressure on Russia's Baltic Fleet. In response, the Kremlin appears to have redirected and repositioned many of its naval assets to this area, attempting to build up a force that might counter NATO's expansion and protect Russian interests and shipping routes. But the sad fact of the matter for Russia is that its best efforts simply aren't good enough. While the Kremlin does not release official data regarding how many ships make up its Baltic Fleet, an open-source report that was published earlier this year by the International Institute for Strategic Studies found that it includes around 69 vessels in total. Compared to the full might of the naval forces that NATO members can deploy, that's not a big number. And it gets worse for Russia, as many of the 69 vessels making up the Baltic Fleet are said to be on the older and smaller side. In other words, this isn't a fleet of high-end, state-of-the-art warships, destroyers, and submarines. Instead, it's largely comprised of vessels that wouldn't stand much chance at all in any kind of confrontation with NATO forces. And this was confirmed by a former Belgian Navy officer named Frederik van Lokeren. Writing for the online news portal Naval News, van Lokeren looked at how the Russian Navy had suffered in recent years at the hands of Ukrainian drones and missiles, writing, "The Russian Navy, and more specifically its Baltic Sea fleet, has been on the receiving end of a targeted Ukrainian naval campaign that saw the use of unmanned surface vessels and cruise missiles. As a result of this naval campaign, several vessels of Russia's Black Sea fleet were damaged and destroyed, and the fleet itself was forced to abandon its bases in Crimea and withdrew to the naval base of Novorossiysk in southern Russia." The former officer went on to analyze Russia's recent naval training exercises and attempts to better protect its naval assets, but came to one clear conclusion about Russia's naval prospects in comparison to NATO's. Within the Baltic Sea, the Russian Baltic Fleet is severely outnumbered compared to the available NATO forces of the Baltic Sea nations. The Baltic Fleet also largely operates from Kaliningrad, which is an exposed location, surrounded and isolated by neighboring countries which are part of NATO. It is not expected that in the current situation, the Baltic Fleet will be able to put up much resistance given the overwhelming directly available NATO forces within the Baltic region. Van Lokeren says that Russia could potentially give its navy a fighting chance against NATO by investing in the development of unmanned surface vessels, otherwise known as marine drones. But he also notes that NATO already has a bit of a head start in this area thanks to Ukraine. NATO forces will undoubtedly also have studied Ukrainians' USV campaign in the Black Sea and probably have direct access to data and knowledge from Ukraine itself. NATO is gaining more valuable experience in drone warfare all the time. Its forces are learning from engagements with Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, for example, and uncovering new strategies and tactics to both utilize maritime drones offensively and defend against them. We've already seen numerous NATO warships deploying additional light and heavy machine guns along their outer decks, for example, to more effectively neutralize incoming swarms. The anonymous NATO official agrees with Van Lokeren's assessment, stating, "I do think allies have a technological advantage over Russia when it comes to readied and effective naval drones, but we can't let off the gas, and they, allied nations, must maintain a sense of urgency as we seek to maintain and increase our edge with innovation." In other words, as long as NATO keeps up the hard work, continues to learn valuable lessons from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and maintains its commitment to initiatives like Baltic Sentry, there's very little that the Russian Navy can do against it. It certainly doesn't have the necessary number of vessels to assert dominance in regions like the Baltic Sea, nor does it have the infrastructure needed to project power in areas like the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, the Kremlin's naval forces find themselves in an utterly humiliating position, forced out of the Tartus base they relied on for so many years, and without any other home to turn to in the Mediterranean region. Their numbers are dwindling too, thanks to Ukraine's many successful drone and missile strikes over the course of the war so far. Kyiv taking out submarines, landing ships, frigates, corvettes, and other vessels. And with Ukraine getting stronger all the time, strengthening its drone army and expanding its missile strike capabilities, there's no telling how much more the Russian Navy may suffer at the hands of its enemies in the weeks and months to come. We could see the likes of long Neptune missile strikes on more Russian ports, for example, or maritime drone attacks on Kilo-class submarines and Baltic Fleet frigates. In summary, the Russian Navy is in a terrible situation, and there are zero signs of it getting any better anytime soon. You can learn more about Russia's woes at sea in our recent look at how Denmark has cut off a major Baltic Sea lifeline for the Kremlin. Or for a bigger, broader look at the state of the war today, check out this video, offering an in-depth breakdown of how Ukraine's strategy has evolved over time and how it now has its best ever chance of pushing on and winning this war once and for all. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications too, so you can stay informed and up to date on everything that's happening along the front lines of Ukraine, plus big news from other conflicts around the world. And thank you as always for watching.